Our guest tonight is the man charged with leading the Coalition's campaign against Labor's proposed carbon tax, Opposition Environment spokesman Greg Hunt. Welcome to The Drum.
Good evening. It's a real pleasure. It's my first appearance on The Drum.
Well, welcome indeed to you. Now, you were not quite almost thrown out of question time this afternoon. We were talking to Lyndall Curtis earlier. It was a particularly feisty sort of an exchange. Once again, that PhD of yours was brought up. Have you got a problem here with credibility, given that you were for an ETS before you were against it?
Well, firstly, I better correct the record there because I don't want to overstate my academic credentials. It was a 1990 undergraduate law thesis, and my argument then, as is now, is that we do need market mechanisms to address pollution issues, and the debate today is about good versus bad market mechanisms. I recognise that the Home Insulation Program, the Green Loans Program and Cash for Clunkers Program were all examples of bad market mechanisms, and it's a bad market mechanism to use electricity pricing, which is an essential service, to drive up the costs without driving down demand. The history of Australian electricity pricing is costs go up, demand barely moves, and we think there's a better way, and I'm quite hopeful about that. Is
this a case, though, Greg, of follow the leader? In 2007, when John Howard was supporting a carbon price and an ETS, did you support it?
Well, actually, in 2006, I set out this direct action model in a speech to the Centre for Independent Studies, the 30th of November 2006, Australia's Clean Energy Future. I set it out, I put it on the table. But it wasn't the policy. Model.
Did you support the policy when it was formulated?
Look, my approach was to set out what I believed, and I still think that, I believe passionately in action, but I have long argued over 20 years for the use of best practice market mechanisms, and my view has never changed that I think the best way to do this is without driving up electricity prices, because it's dramatically ineffective and it is ultimately regressive, which means for your listeners it's the lowest income earners, the middle income earners who hurt the most but who are least able to reduce their use of electricity.
There's a fairly sizable line forming of economists and business people supporting the direction that the Gillard government is heading on all of this. At the moment, though, the direct action policy is lucky to get any direct support. Would you be prepared to send around that undergraduate thesis of yours from 1990 and your direct action policy and see which one gets more approval right now?
Well, they're not at odds with each other.
Well, there's an inconsistency over the pricing mechanism, though.
No, there's not.
There's not?
Have you read my 1990 thesis? Or are you just going to talk about it?
Well, okay, put it this way. Do you think that there would be more support for a mechanism approach that we're talking about now, if there was bipartisan support? Because effectively in 2007 there was.
Our approach is very clear that we think there's a better way than using a $300 rising to $600 electricity tax per family, and we stand by that. And I think that politics and Parliament is about the contest of ideas. We agree on the science, we agree on the targets, we disagree on the mechanisms. My work for 20 years has been on about good and bad market mechanisms. A bad market mechanism is where you fight economic history, and the economic history is that electricity and petrol are, in economic terms, inelastic goods, in human terms, essential services, and therefore you hurt the lowest income earners. I would much rather be hopeful and focus on incentives to drive down emissions by cleaning up your lawn power station, by cleaning up coal mines, by capturing carbon in our soils and in our farms and in our trees, real things that can reduce emissions immediately.
Greg, hi. So you posed a really big question for me, and that is just how important is getting an answer to climate change? If you guys aren't going to give and you're going to block the tax, can we actually wait another 2 years before you guys get in the government to have your own way? I mean, is it a today issue that's got to be dealt with, or is it something that can wait? I suppose that's my question.
Well, no, we will meet the 2020 targets on the same time frame, on the same basis as the government is proposing. In fact, we will be able to start faster than the government because we can put in place real reductions immediately by providing incentives. So we could begin transforming, for example, the Yallourn power station from the dirtiest brown coal along with Hazelwood through to gas. I say this because the CEO has publicly said he would be far more likely to change and clean up his power station under the Coalition's incentive approach than under the government's carbon tax. The reason being he'd simply pass through the price to consumers who would have to wear it. So that's why we'll meet the targets on the same time frame, but in a way which is far more efficient.
But isn't it a little bit more complex than that? Because the market and in that the industry has to get a signal as soon as possible so that they can actually begin the capex to actually do the massive overhaul of their infrastructure. I mean, business can't really wait for surety for another 2 years, I would have thought.
With great respect, I think you're completely wrong, because there's no certainty under a floating price. They'll have a floating volume first off under the carbon tax, and then that will change. And it is business themselves that have said, well, we wouldn't transition from brown coal to gas because the price needed to drive that transition is dramatically higher than the government's talking about. Instead, we'll just pass it through to consumers. So the test for the government now is to say which power stations will they clean up? Because I can point to power stations immediately that we would be able to clean up. I can point to coal mines through the capture of waste coal mine gas and its conversion to renewable energy, which we can clean up. And so I think there are a number of tests. Right now it would be useful for the government to say which power stations they'll clean up, if any, and right now it would be useful for them to say what will be the cost for households, and the challenge is include this in the budget. There's no reason why you should exclude this from the budget if you want to be.
And it looks as though we've lost our link to Greg Hunt in Canberra, which is unfortunate. It is a complex issue, Dom Knight. It's something, I suppose, that a lot of people, they hear the government and the opposition arguing the merits for and against on all this. It's hard to know who to believe. Should we get a taxpayer-funded education campaign to tell us?
Well, I mean, look, as long as there's no Joe Cocker this time around, I'm fine with it. But it is complex and difficult, but I'm very reluctant about these government-funded taxpayer campaigns. And I said we've got Greg back here, so I might ask him the question that I was going to ask, which is, firstly, aren't you in fact not agreed on the science when Tony Abbott's on record as saying he thinks the world's getting colder, and Nick Minchin said that recently? But secondly, isn't the difference between the two models right now that one provides a disincentive for the whole of industry to clean up its act? The other says to most people, look, go on producing carbon, we'll try and mop it up and just take a couple of key things and like the power industry and trying to clean them up. Isn't there only one genuine market mechanism in this that's on the table at the moment?
The answer to each of the questions respectfully is no and no. Our position on the science is that we accept the science, we accept the need for action, and we accept the human contribution, and we'll deliver the action. Now, on the market mechanism, it's very important to understand that you take three of the Nobel economic laureates from the last decade, Thomas Schelling, Vernon Smith, Finn Kydland. They ranked 15 different approaches using economic mechanisms to deal with climate change, and they ranked as the least efficient the carbon tax. And they looked at three different models of the carbon tax out of this 15, and the bottom three were all variations on the carbon tax. And the reason why is it doesn't actually drive real change, and it doesn't do it in a highly efficient way. If you provide an incentive to reduce emissions directly, where every dollar goes to reducing emissions rather than cycles around the economy, you can do real things.
Greg Hunt, why are you as opposed, as you appear to be, certainly in Parliament today you were, to the idea of an education campaign if the government is going to try and explain this, if we're going to be paying this tax?
I think this is taxpayers' money which is being misappropriated for an entirely political purpose. I think the Prime Minister should rule out a political advertising campaign using taxpayer funds. The ALP should pay if they want to run such a campaign.
So, Greg, I assume you had the same position on the GST ads, which was another big piece of tax reform that was explained via taxpayer ads.
it's our watch now, and we went to the election with a $50 million cut in government advertising, and we went to the election with a pledge not to advertise for or against a carbon tax or equivalent mechanism. This is our watch. We took the policy to the election, and the Prime Minister should match that policy, and if the ALP wants an election campaign, they should pay for it, not the Australian taxpayer, which means nurses, plumbers, shop assistants.
Okay. Unfortunately, Sue, I'm sorry, we are out of time. Greg Hunt, terrific to have you on the drum at last. Thank you very much for joining us in Canberra. That is all the time we have for another night. Joining me on the panel tonight was Sue Cato from Cato Council, Dom Knight from The Chaser, as well as Greg Hunt in Canberra. We had Lyndall Curtis. You can catch the website